what is the big workforce development challenge we have in the next decade?
I think there's a number of things that form the challenge. One for sure.
Beth Cobert, former president and Markle Foundation.
How are we going to get an entire workforce of individuals, all from a different starting place, adapting to the things technology will enable them to do that they can't do now? AI this, AI that, we all got that. But it really does and can change the way people work if they get the opportunity to learn and try this. So there's this big piece about technology adoption that is a big challenge, because otherwise your organization, whether it's in government or the nonprofit sector or the private sector, will get left behind at people who are better at using those tools than you are.
Well, Beth, I'm so excited to chat with you today. It was very fortuitous that I met one of your colleagues who introduced me to you. And then we realized we have a lot of shared things. Same college. You also spent some time in McKinsey as well, although you were obviously far more senior there at the firm than I got to. And I just really liked the last time we chatted and just the kinds of things you've shared, your work experience, which so much to learn from. So thanks for taking the time to join.
Happy to do it. And it was fun to find all those, unexpected shared coincidences about life.
Yeah. And by the way, here's the orange.
Good. Excellent.
Anyways, yeah. So maybe the first way to start is I'm just really curious what motivates you to be in the field of talent development, which I think is a pretty consistent thread in many parts of your career.
It's an interesting question that I've reflected on a lot. What gets me excited about this? I think it starts with what I learned from my parents. My dad was the general manager of a textile company. So he had the factory and all those things according to him. And having spent many hot summers working in that factory, I watched and saw what he did in terms of helping people develop and really sort of seeing how he could uncover people's potential. The long end of a story is by the time, like many, many years later, it was two frontline workers who didn't speak any English when they started there, who ended up buying the company and doing really well. So sort of the classic American dream. And they wouldn't have gotten there unless my dad had sort of seen that potential and nurtured it. And I've always found that really interesting, right? How do you get people to, it's the old saying, be all that they can be. And at many levels. And so I find that a fascinating through line. At McKinsey, where I was for a long time, I was always sort of involved in people development stuff versus knowledge development, because I was excited about helping the next person be even better at what they're doing. And I've seen that in so many settings. And it's just sort of every time when you give me the choice of things to spend time in, that's sort of where I end up going.
Yeah. And by the way, that really resonates with me too. I think there's part of me that always just really liked the people development side of things throughout wherever I was. And for me, the interest comes from being an immigrant, I would say. And sort of, there's something about reaching your human potential when you're in this new environment that you really end up thinking a lot about. And you see your parents work really hard at it. And then I think you have their values. One thing that's just incredible about your career is you've really been the tri-sector athlete. I think some people call people that. I think it'd be really great for you to share what are the insights you've gathered on talent development as you move through private, public, impact sectors, and maybe some nuances you found there.
So, there's a couple things that I come to when I think about this, having worked in very different environments, from McKinsey to the federal government, to work in the nonprofit sector when I was at Markle, and in fact, a lot of work with the state government and through that Markle work. And there's some things that are the same, and there's some things that are different. So I'm going to start with the same. People. There are fantastic performers at every level in every one of those organizations. And there's also people who aren't so excited about their performance in every organization. So you've got a lot of just things that come with people. There's things that come at scale. When you think about government and trying to get something done, like especially at the federal government level, it's really big. But like big companies are different than small companies. So sometimes when we make these comparisons, we're sort of ignoring those differences. So people are people no matter where you find them. I think there's some really different things about contexts that are very important to think about, right? When I think about the private sector, we'll start there, right? Very clear motivation about how do you grow profits and value in a company. You want to create value over time, and you're either going to maximize value for your shareholders, or you're going to maximize value for your stakeholders, whichever form of capitalism you choose. But it's pretty clear what the metrics are. You have a pretty dynamic workforce flowing in and out, and you've got some clear metrics about what performance looks like. In the nonprofit sector, the motivating factor is about mission, right? People work there because they care about the environment. They care about improving the lives of kids. They care about helping people get better jobs. So there's a big mission motivation, and frankly, not a lot of resources. I'll come back to that in the government too. And that is a real constraint. And then in the government, you have all those things, plus frankly, a level of scrutiny where, you want people to take initiative and do things, but there are real rules, right? If you're working for the federal government, your job is to execute the budget that Congress gave you, whether you agree with it or not. And so there's a lot about rules and compliance that play a slightly different role. And so that plays out in talent development. Many people come to the public sector because there are lots of opportunities for internal mobility and advancement, but it's a more typically slow and steady model. You don't have people jumping around as much from job to job. So there's a lot about how do you get better at your job as opposed to aiming for the next promotion. And I'll come back to resources. The biggest difference around talent development in some of these places is literally the scarcity of resources to do it. In a tough budget environment in government, in the corporate sector too, but even more so in government, training is one of the first things to go. And that is really to the detriment of people. So that can be a challenge. But at the same time, I will just say the probably best institution in this country in talent development is the government. It's the U.S. military. They are unbelievable at taking people who come in with a vast array of diverse experiences, giving them real and tangible skills, turning them into high-performing units, and actually investing in people over the course of their careers, right? Whether you're a non-commissioned officer or an officer, you get formal training all the time, not just on technical skills, but on leadership skills. So in some ways, the best example of talent development is the government, which I don't think people think about when they sometimes think about those things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't even really think about and make that connection, but that's totally right. Definitely see how the constraints and the conditions are very different across sectors. Did you see very different talent development practices as a result, in terms of the way it gets framed and the way it gets delivered? Or I'm curious if you actually saw more similarities.
So there's a mix of both. So I'll give you one example from the nonprofit sector this time, right? Think about being a frontline sort of service delivery organization in workforce. So you're trying to, work with all these, you're a career coach in a local nonprofit, and your job is to try and help connect people to better jobs. And you get, if that's your job, that training matters as one of the ways to help people advance. On the other hand, the metrics that you're judged by either the government that's funding you or foundations giving you grants, is how many people are you placing? And sort of time for training is overhead. And most foundations don't like to fund what they consider overhead. And so we had built, when I was at the Markle Foundation, through this fantastic program we had called the Rework America Alliance, we had put together a digital program to help career coaches be more effective in connecting workers with great skills, but not bachelor's degrees, to jobs. And it was about being human-centered, and it was about understanding labor market information and really helping people build a sense of, the workers build a sense of agency. And when we shared it with coaches, we built it with them, they thought it was fantastic. When you tried to implement this, the biggest challenge we had was not that people weren't interested, couldn't do it, is literally they couldn't find the time because they had so many hours in a day. and they had to meet their metrics. So you've got this problem of how do you get time and capacity to do things that I think is a real constraint. And that's probably the biggest difference. Is not the will to learn, it's the capacity and the programs that get put in front of folks that can be a challenge.
Interesting. So I guess maybe just thinking through that constraint then, and just thinking through programs. I'm sure you've seen some programs that work really well and programs that don't work as well. What are some top best practice you've seen in training or learning programs or skill building programs that really landed?
So I'll describe these. And I think, Vince, in this case, I'll say these attributes probably cut across. Right. So one is, and the individual at whatever level in the organization can see how this program is going to both help them do today's job better and get them an opportunity to advance for tomorrow. They understand the connection between what they're learning and how they will be better as a result. That's probably the most important thing. A second piece is that it's a chance to actually build their connection to the organization and other people. So whether it's people on their team, but often it's people outside of their team or other people they have to deal with. When I've seen learning really click, it's because they understand how this fits into the bigger picture, and helps them build a bigger community, makes them more engaged employees, makes them more committed. That's true across all the sectors. I think a third piece about training programs that click is they enable people to do some self-reflection so they aren't one and done, right? You might deliver the program in a dose, whether it's a day or a week or an hour, but there's ways to come back and reinforce, check back in, go back to the thing you learned, look at your notes, talk to the people you were with 3 months later, so that it's not just sort of, it was an incredible day, hour, week, but it ends. I think, that's that connectedness to the people and the learning really helps people put what they've learned to work. So those are at least a couple of attributes that I think cut across.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. Like explain the why, create the human connection, and create some sort of a reflection sustainment that goes beyond the actual session. Actually, diving into maybe the second one around like human connection, you probably have seen it in different forms. Curious, can you think of maybe the best example you've seen of a training or a learning program that really fostered this sense of connection and belonging? And what did it do to create that?
So let me pull one out of my government experience, and then I'll think of some others. But one of the things that we worked on when I was at the head of the Office of Personnel Management was trying to bring the principles of sort of human-centered design and design thinking to government, right? My jobs in government were not particularly political. It was literally trying to make the government operate better, right? You wanted things to work better. And so we had a team that was working on how to make the process for applying for free and reduced school lunch and breakfast better so that we could get actually the people who were qualified to be in the program to have this benefit that they needed, to make sure that it was getting to them. And so, as I said, the government, Congress, when they write laws or when we write regs, there's a lot of rules about what you have to do, and you can get stuck trying to manage the rules as opposed to manage the outcomes. And, human-centered design principles really help with that. So we had this program where we were trying to treat human-centered design, but we did it by working on an actual project, which was bringing together the folks from the Department of Agriculture who runs this program, the OPM who was leading it. There were all sorts of different, cross-agency people who had to be engaged. And we were teaching them human-centered design by actually doing human-centered design on this project. And what made it so powerful was that We had a few people who were helping to lead the program who were really good. So they were really experts. Two, these were people who had worked together before, but this was kind of a different way of reframing their relationships. And so that opened up new avenues for them to learn about each other and appreciate the expertise and the constraints that they were facing. And it was actually going to turn into something when they were done. It was going to turn into a new application. So they knew this was going to be tangible. And I think it really gave them this boost of energy, not just to get this done, but, like all good things, once you get the design done, you then got to go and implement the damn thing. And so the relationships that got built, the trust that got built, the understanding of each other's perspectives was really sustained as we rolled this out. And then they could take what they'd learned, this was the idea, and then they could apply that to the next set of problems that they had in their agencies. There's lots of government forms that could be easier to deal with, right? So it was a way of trying to take that and do it. And it worked really well because they all, frankly, cared so much about the mission. And they were all sort of coming into it as equals in their learning. So that was one that I was really excited about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It really hits on the why is very clear, that there's a problem and there's also something that's going to get actually implemented. They're working in teams, working on projects. So there's a sense of we're in it together and let's create something meaningful and valuable. And then it gets taken to other parts of the organization. So, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Having project-based learning like that can be very powerful. It's not always possible for organizations to set up something like that. So have you seen when that's not possible and when the delivery is more, hey, we have to upskill people on certain topics or some certain areas, any example where you've seen, okay, it's not quite the project-based thing, but it really did deliver on its promise to help people improve?
Yeah. So I'll think about a couple. And I think this is where it also becomes really important to think about not just your why, the why is important, but the who. And what's the context under which they are operating, right? How are they, again, if you don't work at a desk with a computer, it's very hard to do online learning, except with your phone. And if it's with your phone and you're working out on a factory floor, you better have a place where you can go sit where it's quiet. So you need a space with internet where it's quiet. So that's the first constraint, is how do you do this in a way that actually people are in an environment where they can access the learning and actually execute it. And by the way, on company time, not just in their spare time after work, right? So there's a whole set of constraints. If you're in a restaurant, right? How do you do training? Well, you do it, at the shifts before. You've watched a restaurant, get people set up before they're doing it. So one way you can do it is you can sort of do the slow pilot model, right? You've probably all been to the restaurant, right? Where they're doing the friends and family opening 2 weeks before. That's training and learning, right? They're learning what to do about the way they're expected to interact with customers. They're learning about the process. They're learning about the staff. So one way you can do that is to slow down the pace of the sort of work so that people can learn and get coached in the way they do it. And that is actually effective because you're really doing the real thing. That's one model. There's other models that are more sort of, lesson based. And then I think the question is, how do you break it into small enough absorbable chunks so you sort of get things in bite-sized pieces that you can learn, you can test your own learning, you can go back and check on it, and then put it into place and get a little coaching as you go. That's a different way of doing things. And those can work too. I think the main pieces when I think about what it needs to be, people need to have the time and the space. They need to have a place, and they need to have the safety of saying, okay, I'm going to try this new thing, but if it isn't working, I'm going to get some help, right? It's a different way of teaching things.
And I'm really seeing, by the way, the human-centered design mindset coming through with your thinking, because you're basically saying it needs to fit their environment, their mindset. what's available for them, but also literally what is a human mind able to absorb. And you got to design for all of those things. Great. I want to zoom out maybe a little bit, especially because you've seen these different sectors. So you have a very expansive view of the workforce development challenge that exists today. I guess I'm curious how you would think about framing the top line for what is the big workforce development challenge we have in the next decade.
Oh, wow. Boy, there's I could go so many places with that. So I think there's a number of things that form the challenge. One for sure is, how are we going to get an entire workforce of individuals, all from a different starting place, adapting to the things technology will enable them to do that they can't do now, right? We can AI this, AI that, we all got that. But it really does and can change the way people work if they get the opportunity to learn and try this. So there's this big piece about technology adoption that I think people that is a big challenge, because otherwise your organization, whether it's in government or the nonprofit sector or the private sector, will get left behind at people who are better at using those tools than you are. And honestly, our collective experience during COVID in some ways gives me a fair amount of optimism about that, right? We went from a country where, for the people who had the privilege of staying home, from working like next door to people to, doing things like this, and it became the norm pretty quickly at a pretty high level of effectiveness. And if you had said either all those workplace meetings are going to go to that form, or even teaching, which was, who could have imagined it not being in person, to this, that was a remarkable amount of transformation, super fast. And so I think people have the ability to do that. Right now, the thing that made one of the things that I think helped us in that is it really did feel like we were all in it together, right? Whether you were the junior person or the senior person, certainly if you were me, everybody was forgetting to turn off their mute button. And everybody's family members or dog was running out and out of their Zoom screen. And, people forgot how to share screens. So it was sort of, there wasn't a you get it, I get it, as much as there was, oh shoot, we're all in this together, we have to figure it out together. And so I think that's one of the opportunities, sorry about that, AI transformation that, and I sit on a public company board, I sit on a university board, like everybody's making this up everybody's learning this as we go. So I think framing this as a chance for everyone to learn together is one of the ways that we're actually going to get through this, and do it in a way that will actually help people adapt, as opposed to having it done to them.
Yeah. I definitely think the pace of change seems incredibly fast. Maybe every generation says that, but this time it feels particularly acute to me, because AI somehow gets at the core of challenging what is humanity, right? And almost makes you elevate yourself to be relevant, right? I'm curious, how do you think, do you think that this is an opportunity more to drive equity in outcomes? Because anyone can really learn the tool if they put in the time. Or do you think it's actually going to be the natural force will actually create more inequitable outcomes, and we're going to have to really fight that trend?
So I think you really frame this, and I think in ways that we didn't with some other things. I think we have to really think about, if we want outcomes to be more equitable, how we're going to get them there, right? And what's sort of benefits to society at large don't accrue to every person. And so how are we actually going to help people adapt whose jobs may be at risk? How will we help them build the new skills that they will need? But we've watched this movie in the past, and it doesn't come out to produce equity and opportunity unless we decide we want it to. So that's a choice for us as a society in terms of how important the importance we place on that. It's the way we think about creating opportunities. It's the way, is a large company really only focused on sort of training their senior executives on what AI is and not their middle and lower level staff because they figure they'll just hire somebody who does, right? Well, like, where are those people who, if you want somebody in one of those roles who knows how to use AI today, they don't exist. You actually have to invest in people to create them. You can't hire someone with those skills because, they aren't there. I did a lot of work in the federal government, way more than I thought I would, on cybersecurity. And, you'd have all these people who were looking to hire people who had strong cyber backgrounds. Well, up until a number of years ago, nobody who majored in computer science learned anything about cybersecurity when they were in school. So who were you hiring? So it's a little bit the same thing, right? You can't just hire away the talent you need. You actually have to invest in it or figure out, how, what to do about that. So I don't think AI will destroy all jobs, but I do think it takes a conscious effort to think about how we can use it as a way to empower more people and not fewer.
Yeah. This actually reminds me of something that Ethan Mollick was talking about, which was the current sort of development in AI is going to put an incredible pressure, but also opportunity for L&D teams to play a very pivotal role, because it's really changed. One, as you said, the demand for actually developing people is going to be bigger to stay relevant. And secondly, a lot of you and I talked about this last time a little bit, a lot of the early career stuff where you just work at it over years to build a judgment is going away in many ways. And so then how do you then get people to become the middle managers, the experts, when those pathways are getting disrupted left and right by technology?
I think you're completely right. I've been listening to some of the Ethan Mollick book, podcasts, et cetera, the same thing, right? So I may have told you this story when we talked. I'm old enough to remember some things. And I remember one of my banking clients where we put in an automated underwriting system, right? It took all the data you entered on your mortgage form and did all the calculations, sort of giving you the equivalent of a score and stuff. And when we went to implement this, the folks who normally did the underwriting would they'd get sort of, think of it as the score sheet with all the key statistics already calculated. Great, right? You can go through it, you just need to look. And literally you watch them sitting there recalculating all the numbers. And we were like, why? Why are you doing that? The answer is right there. And they were one of them said to us, but the way I get a feel for the borrower is by doing the calculations. It's the way I sort of get my sense of the person, their capabilities, how the numbers relate to each other. And staring at the page doesn't do that for me. Well, that sort of defeated the whole purpose of creating this much more efficient and effective way of doing things. But you had to figure out a new way for people to build judgment and learning. And I think that is a really important challenge. And whether that's, do L&D teams get really good at creating simulations? We know certainly still, right? AI is far from infallible. So how do you build enough judgment to know whether what it's telling you is deeply insightful or, wrong? And I think you're going to have to think consciously about how you build those skills in people. And I think that's a real need and opportunity.
I want to ask you about your experience at McKinsey. Because one, I'm someone who actually really appreciate the learning I got back at McKinsey. I think they did an incredible job taking me from a very naive new grad that knew nothing other than just kind of schoolwork into training me to become a professional. And McKinsey puts a lot of emphasis on senior leaders to apprentice the next generation and really instill kind of the greatness that they've seen in different parts of work and help the next generation learn it. So now thinking back to your time there where you did a lot of people development work, what are some top strategies you've seen, either you use yourself or your leaders, to help train the next generation on the judgment that you were talking about?
It's a really good question. And I learned a lot. I think McKinsey's ability to mold people from sort of fundamentally knowing nothing to having a really structured way of breaking down a problem, thinking about what's important, finding pragmatic ways to bring things back, and then continually testing and evaluating them is one of the greatest things it does. It's a mindset. I saw a number of things that I thought were helpful. So one is just personal observation. It was being in the room. I remember one progress review, client presentation, where we'd done all this work and we thought we'd nailed it. We felt so good. And the senior client at one point says, well, I think you all have missed the seminal issue. And I watched the senior partner without losing a beat. I was like sliding under the table, but the senior partner, without losing a beat, said, well, tell me what you think that issue is, because I really want to understand where you're coming from. And I was like, my jaw, like you're lifting my jaw. And it got to this great conversation. It was an enormous lesson in listening. And actually, as I watched, because it turns out we hadn't missed the seminal issue, we just didn't think it was as seminal. And it was in there, in the appendix on page 13. But it was a lesson in relationship building. It was a lesson in listening. So one is observation, right? You got to see that. And you did that by being in the room, by being in the meeting. I think that's one of the most important ways people do it. The other ways, I think, it is about real-time feedback from those meetings, right? What did you do well? What didn't you do well? What could you have done better the next time? It's, I can think of the best folks who mentored me, had me out like farther out on the plank than I thought I could go. But they were still there in case I stumbled. And so how do you give people the chance to try things themselves in an environment that's safe? So how do you let, when you're having a big team meeting and the senior partners there, how do you, as the engagement manager or the project lead, let the most junior person present? Because honestly, there is no downside to the project, to the client, to your impact if the junior person doesn't do a great job presenting in that session, like zero downside. But it's, as the junior person, we all remember, right, being really nervous about that. But you learned. And so you got a chance to try things. And so how do you create those spaces which let people try things? And then there was, real training and learning and development. But it is all about that mindset that says, I am trying to get this person so they can do the mindset. Always, to me, what was successful and the best people developers were always looking for ways for people on their team to step up to do more, because that creates more capacity, as opposed to worrying about wait, they're taking my role. Like the better your team was, the better you were. And so I think that mindset is really important and a real commitment to it, right? So it's like feedback, but caring.
Yeah. And it's, for me, that was an incredible part of the culture that was just woven into the organization, at least when I spent time there. Have you seen ways to create that kind of culture in other places? And if so, what helps that? Because I think actually many organizations don't have it. And this is why you see statistics of most people being, disengaged at work or having bad managers and leaving because they're kind of resigned from the fact that they don't have a great work environment.
Yeah. So I think it starts with this mindset that says, the better the people who report to me are, the better I will perform, the better my team will perform, and everything will be better. If you come at this with this zero-sum mindset, you're lost. And by the way, no one will want to work for you. So that's the first thing. You got to believe that everybody brings insight and a special perspective. This is what inclusion really is. People are really bringing something. You have to start with that core belief. And so that when you can get that expertise out of them and help them do more, the overall team performance is better. It's the opposite of a zero-sum mindset. So that is, I think, the place it starts. And I think there's lots of things you can do if you want to build those capabilities. And they can be big things or little things. So in my days in government, which is a reasonably hierarchical place, right? A large portion of the federal workforce served in the military, and the military is a great talent developer, but it is a hierarchical system, right? I was very conscious about, how did I make sure that the junior people who were in the room felt like they had agency to speak? Because that wasn't typically their role. Like you have a big table, everybody's sitting at the back bench. So if there are empty seats, everybody had to sit at the table. And I would tell people, we're going to go around the room and I want to hear from everyone. And everyone's going to tell me, it was quite conscious. If you're sitting here, you're going to talk today. And a little bit of fair warning so they could have some plan, time to think of what they might say. But it was really trying to create that atmosphere so that people had the chance to express their view. I think that's one thing that was really helpful in terms of creating a culture where people were all sort of invested in each other's learning. And after a while, I was doing this on purpose and I did it over and over. So people came in and they knew it was going to happen, right? So they actually were able to come in prepared as opposed to worrying about what I was going to say. And the other part about that is, I think, demonstrating with your peers and colleagues that you can disagree, you can have a different perspective. And that's not because you think the person isn't smart or isn't of value, or even that they have a bad idea. You just might think other criteria are more important than the criteria they were using to judge that idea. So there's this, how do you have respectful disagreement, yet walk out, as one team agreed on a course of action and knowing that you got to a better answer because you had that disagreement. That's a really hard thing to build culturally, people being willing to disagree and feel respected for it. I think that's another really important attribute you have to build.
Those things resonate with teams I've been in on where I think I was inspired by the leader, grew the most because they created the space. And yet it's not done often. It's pretty difficult, and it's almost sometimes against nature of, I want to get this stuff done. Then you go for efficiency and you kind of miss this other part. And then in the long term, it's actually less efficient you can move less quickly.
But, so yes, but I guess this is so much part of my innate nature that I don't know how to do it another way. I also think, by the way, again, you can do this quickly, respectfully, and decisively. In my days in the federal government, we had sort of cybersecurity hell about all sorts of different things. And trust me, we were moving incredibly fast because it really was a real crisis. And the most important thing, one of the most important lessons I learned was that you generally had 10 minutes. That was and so getting that input, because there was something, if you didn't ask, that you were blind to and you missed. And so you actually increase your likelihood that you're wrong. And I can think of meeting after meeting where somebody said, well, what about this? And you would say to people, actually, right, we think we're going to do this. We're going to go around and everyone's going to tell me a reason we shouldn't, because we were trying to pressure test something super fast. And there were many times where we're like, okay, we're still going to broadly do that, but we're going to take this piece out or we're going to add this piece in. And we wouldn't have gotten there unless we'd heard from somebody who just came at the problem with a different perspective. They understood how it was going to play in Congress, or they understood what it would mean in the private sector, or they understood the technical implications of what we were trying to do were too complex, whatever it was. but we wouldn't have gotten there without getting the input. And I just think it leads to, fundamentally believe it leads to better decisions. And you can do that pretty damn fast.
Yeah. It really seems like it starts from the right mindset of the leader who understands the value of it and doesn't see it as a trade-off, right? But it actually sees it as an opportunity, which resonates also. Maybe switching a little bit. We've talked a lot about these really important practices that unlock learning, unlock organizations and teams. I think you must have faced this a lot, especially, you've been in different sectors. Doing this at scale is very difficult, right? Anything can be done well in a small scale. But when you think about the scale of entire organization, entire community, an entire country, now you have a very different set of constraints. Any success factors you've seen in being able to actually drive skills, mindset, behavior change at scale?
It's a great question, Vince. It's the one that sort of most people in workforce spend all their time thinking about, because there's like so many great programs in so many great places, and they've served 42 people. And like you need a lot of programs serving 42 people. So I think there's a couple of things that help. One is whatever you're doing, whether it's the learning or the behavior, is really understanding the model you're doing, right? What is it we're actually doing, and having it the equivalent of written down someplace. Like you have to know what it is. There has to be some definition of the process. That's one piece. So you know what are the key steps along the way, and people aren't inventing it each time. Another piece is, as you're trying to scale, what are the ways of sharing the knowledge from place A to place B to place C to place D? It could be, if you're Walmart, they've got thousands of stores, million plus employees, right? They're really good at thinking about how they're going to scale. We in the Rework America Alliance, they were a funder that we worked with a lot, and we got to see how they thought about this. It was really helpful. So one's a clear process. Two is there's some connectivity. So if you are running a program to help folks who've been justice involved get jobs in the trades in Pittsburgh, and someone else is running one in Orange County, California, the odds are you don't know each other, right? So how do you create that connection? And one of the things that we saw that was really helpful is, how do you find organizations, platforms that can help bring that knowledge from one place to the next? When we set up the Rework America Alliance, as an example, we explicitly worked with a set of national organizations that had lots of local delivery points, because we wanted to use their national reach to help scale programs. So whether it was Unidos US, which has, affiliates in hundreds of cities, the National Urban League, Goodwill, Rural LISC, we knew that if we could help figure out what worked in 2 or 3 Unidos affiliates, then Unidos could help us figure out how to get it from 3 to 300. And they did an incredibly good job with that. So it's this connective tissue that goes across. And I'd say the last piece is sort of thinking about, how do you get something that could be a little bit customized, but not overly tailored. So, if you pick your favorite online furniture store these days and you feel like you're customizing your couch, you're not really customizing your couch, right? There's a couch. They have a standard number of pieces, and you can pick the 2 different legs and the fabric and whether you want nail heads. You think you've got something custom to you, but it's standard to them. And so how do you build programs that you can customize the parts that matter, right? But not the parts that don't. So the curriculum for someone to learn to be sort of a first-line responder to a cybersecurity incident is like 99% the same, whether you're in a bank, whether you're in a hospital, whether you're working for the federal government, whether you're working for electric utility, right? There's a set of things you need to pay attention to and do. And so that part of the learning program can be exactly the same. But there's other, like the 5% that's different is the 5% that's different. And so you don't flip that and try and make the whole thing custom when you really only have to customize 5%. That is what gets in the way of scaling a lot, because everybody is special. Like every city is special, every person is special, but there's parts that are actually pretty common.
I was nodding profusely as you were speaking because I think you're hitting all the different components that we, at Sparkwise think a lot actively about, because we're all about scaling, group learning. And so really thinking about what is the model that is kind of structured. How do we collaborate with other parties that have things that allow you to scale? You don't have to own the whole value chain. You got to figure out like what you're really good at and then work with other people who are really good at the other stuff. And then thirdly, provide customization, but to your point, on the things that matter, and standardize 90% of things, because that actually allows you to, reach people more cost effectively.
And I think the last piece, and I'm sure you're doing this as well, is as you start to scale, what are the things that seemed perfect in the first place, but are like 2% off? So you can sort of revisit the standard, sort of the core, right? As you do that learning in a kind of structured way. Because then you can learn as you go.
Do you have an example of a workforce development model that has successfully done this and reached scale?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that have made real progress on this score and are starting to scale. There's, programs like Year Up, Perscolis, Merit America that have created some really creative ways of saying, how do we get people into their first jobs? And in all of those programs, we worked with all of them, have elements that they understand, for example, what's the kind of training someone needs to actually take on their first job, right? And that isn't different in New York or in Chicago or in LA. Goodwill's done a similar thing with some of the AI certificates. Microsoft's got some great programs. And I think when I watch them is they have this core, they have organizations that can network it. The part that are customizable is, who do they work with? Who are the trusted voices in the community who will help you recruit talent and have that talent believe that this isn't a sham? Someone is actually going to give them a good job at the end. Those things are local because it's a different organization in Chicago and LA and Houston and Denver. But the thing you're running them through, the program itself, works because it's been built with input from employers, and the employers, the sort of what you need for that first job is not that different. So those are some examples of people who are trying to scale these programs. There's been some really interesting work done with apprenticeship programs lately that are really starting to scale. Actually, unions do this all the time with the trades, right? They have a program for, electricians and plumbers and carpenters. There's a whole set of sort of scaled programs done through unions. So it's those pieces that I think can work.
Yeah, cool. And I have looked into some of those programs, and the other ones that I haven't heard of, I definitely want to go learn from them. Maybe one last question for you. What is one area you think either the government or business or the impact sector needs to spend more time solving that's not getting enough attention to solve the workforce development challenge that's upcoming?
So I think, can I give you two?
Yeah, of course.
I won't McKinsey cheat and give you three.
Okay.
So one is helping both employers and individuals understand the return on investment in learning and development and training, right? If you're going to enroll in a program as a worker with your time, which is your scarcest commodity, you're probably, certainly if you're a frontline worker, the odds of you working two jobs is quite high, plus like the rest of life. So is, understanding where this program's going to get you, not just for its first job, but over time, and making that visible to you in a way that's understandable. And frankly, doing that for employers so they can see the real benefits of investing in their workforce. So that's one piece that I think is really helpful. The other is together sort of cracking the code on how can I really know what skills Vince has, right? The college degree was a proxy for that. It was a really not a nuanced proxy. Some people, when you're doing IT jobs, you can give people a coding test, but you can only do that towards the end. So how do you help people understand the skills they've built, be able to articulate them, and help companies be able to validate them? I think that is a hard problem. AI may help with that, but it's hard.
Thanks for leaving us with those important thoughts and problems. Great to chat with you, Beth, and I'm so excited for continuing to build a relationship with you beyond the podcast. And I'll hopefully see you also soon in Denver area.
Absolutely. And Vince, I'm really excited to see what you guys are doing, and lots of opportunities for to make learning and development more effective, and glad to see you guys taking on that challenge.
Thank you.
You're welcome.